Larkspur, Montana Territory, 1881. Blood on her mouth, Orinda Vance lay thrown in the saloon mud by the men who had already cost her everything, and the husband they buried was only the first of it, and none of them had noticed yet at the end of the bar the stranger who was about to change that. The Silver Spur's doors swung shut behind her before the laughter even properly started. 40 men inside finding no reason to lower their voices for a widow face down in the street, and Silas Corbin himself stood in the doorway a moment longer than he needed to, watching her push herself up onto her knees with the particular satisfaction of a man who believes he has finally fully won. She had come into that saloon asking for 30 more days on a note her husband had never truly owed, and she was leaving it with a split lip and a warning ringing in her ears that the sheriff would be along inside the week to see the ranch emptied properly. What Corbin did not see because his back was to the bar and his whole attention was on the woman kneeling in the mud was the quiet man at the far end of the room setting down a half-finished glass of whiskey with a soft, deliberate click and rising, unhurried. Her name was Orinda Vance. This is the story of the night the town threw her away, and the nameless gunslinger who picked her back up. It was late September in Larkspur, a cattle and rail town pressed up against the Absaroka foothills in the Montana Territory, the kind of autumn evening when the cottonwoods along the creek had gone the color of old brass and every rancher within 20 miles was either bringing stock down off the high pasture. Lost, hard winter. If you're settling in for the whole ride tonight, stay with me clear through to the end, because what that stranger did after he set his glass down on the bar is worth every minute of getting there, and let me know down in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Because I do like knowing how far a story like this one travels before the night's through. Now, let's go back 3 years, past the humiliation and the mud and the laughing, to the autumn Orinda Vance first came to Larkspur as a bride of 20, and the 800 acres along Cottonwood Creek that she and her husband built out of nothing but 2 mules, a wagon, and a stubborn kind of hope that neither of them had any real business affording. She had come out from Ohio on the strength of a letter and a promise, married within a week of stepping off the stage to a broad-shouldered young rancher named Silas Vance, a man 11 years her senior who had filed his claim on Cottonwood Creek 4 years before, and had by the time Orinda arrived, built a one-room cabin, a decent barn, and precious little else besides a fierce, quiet certainty that the ground he'd chosen would someday be worth every year he'd already spent proving it up. Elias was not a man given to pretty speeches. He courted Orinda by letter the way he did everything else, plainly and without embellishment, describing the creek and the grass and the mountains at his back with more affection than most men reserve for describing a woman, who had buried both her parents to a fever the winter before and had nothing left to hold her in Ohio, found in his letters exactly the kind of steadiness she had stopped believing she'd ever be offered. She stepped down off that stage into a country wider and harder than anything she'd imagined, looked at the stranger waiting to marry her with dust on his boots and an honest, uncomplicated hope in his face. She was not wrong, whatever hardship the next 3 years brought them, and it brought plenty. Orinda never once, not even at the very worst of it, regretted stepping off that stage. They built Cottonwood Creek Ranch together the way most homestead marriages were built in that country, one exhausting season at a time. Orinda learning to keep hens and put up preserves and clear a rattlesnake off the porch rail before it got close enough to matter. Elias breaking a second herd onto grass nobody else in the valley had wanted because nobody else understood how good the water was. By their third summer, they had 1,100 head, a proper 2-room house with glass windows, freighted in from Bozeman, and the particular quiet pride of 2 people who had built something real out of almost nothing. The creek ran through the middle of their land, clear and cold, and never once failed, even in the worst of the dry years, fed by a spring high up in the foothills that Elias had found the first summer and guarded, in his own understated way, like the most valuable thing either of them owned. Though neither of them yet understood how much trouble that one fact was going to cause, Orinda used to say, in the years after, that those first 3 seasons were the happiest of her whole life, harder than anything she'd known in Ohio, and better for exactly that reason. The trouble had a name, and the name was Silas Corbin, and by the time Orinda arrived in Larkspur, he already owned the only bank in 3 counties, held the paper on more than half the ranches in the valley, a cattle operation large enough that the rail spur into Larkspur existed mostly to move his stock east. Corbin was not a man who rode in shooting. He was patient and precise, and understood that a signature on a note was worth considerably more than a bullet, because a signature could be foreclosed on legally, in daylight, with the sheriff standing by to enforce it, while a bullet drew questions a careful man preferred to avoid. Over 6 years he had absorbed 9 homestead claims along the valley's better water, each one following roughly the same quiet pattern. A generous-sounding loan offered at exactly the moment a family needed it most. Terms that tightened without anyone quite noticing until they tightened all the way shut. A barn fire, a poisoned well, a spooked herd that made selling out to Corbin's bank look to an exhausted family like the only sensible choice left. The Dunmores had sold 2 summers back after their hay barn burned down twice in one season. Under circumstances the county never bothered investigating closely. Old man Ochoa had sold the summer after that. Once his well went inexplicably foul the same month, Corbin's bank called his note due early. Cottonwood Creek, with its spring that never failed even in drought, was, everyone in Larkspur understood this, even if nobody said it above a whisper, the single richest water claim Silas Corbin did not yet own. Corbin made his first real approach to Elias in the spring of their second year, dressed up as neighborly generosity, a loan, modest and reasonable on paper, to dig a second well and expand the herd before eastern beef prices climbed any higher. The kind of ordinary arrangement half the valley had already accepted without a second thought. Ilias, who had learned caution watching what happened to the Dunmores and the Ochoas, turned him down flat twice and let Orinda know afterward, in his plain, unhurried way, that he'd rather dig the well himself with a spade and a mule than owe Silas Corbin $1 he didn't have to owe him. Corbin did not take the refusal personally, or never showed it if he did. He simply waited, certain that sooner or later every ranch in the valley came to a season hard enough. That season came for the Vances in their 3rd winter, when a late blizzard killed nearly 200 head and a spring flood took out the better part of their hay crop the following June, and Corbin's bank happened to have, waiting conveniently on the counter the same week, a loan agreement already drawn up and ready for a signature, smaller than the well loan he'd offered 2 years before, framed as simple bridge money, the kind of thing any rancher in the valley might sign without losing sleep over it. Elias signed it. It was the only real mistake he ever made in 3 years of marriage, and it cost him everything. None of which is to say those years were unhappy ones, because they were not. Orinda held on to the good of them fiercely in the years that followed, turning the memories over like stones worn smooth from handling. Elias teaching her to ride astride instead of side saddle the first spring. Because a ranch wife who couldn't sit a horse properly was no use to him or to herself, both of them laughing until they couldn't breathe the first half-dozen times she came off, the two of them lying out on a quilt some clear July night. In the plain, unromantic way he had of saying the truest things, almost as an afterthought, admitted he hadn't expected, filing that claim 4 years before, that the best thing to ever happen on Cottonwood Creek would turn out to be a woman getting off a stage from Ohio. There had been a baby lost early in their second year, a grief they carried together without ever quite finding the words for it. And there had been, in its place, a closeness between them that Orinda would later understand, wordless certainty that whatever the country threw at them, they would face it standing next to each other. She held on to every bit of that through everything that came after, because it reminded her, on the nights when giving up would have been the easiest thing in the world, exactly what she had already survived losing once and was not prepared to lose again. The note came due in the second week of August, and Elias, who had spent the whole summer working every honest angle he could think of to raise the payment, selling yearlings early at a worse price than he wanted, taking on day work branding for a neighboring outfit, was 3 days shy of having the full amount in hand when Corbin's foreman, a broad, flat-eyed man named Dutch Marrow, who ran what Corbin liked to call his range crew, and everyone else in the valley simply called his enforcers, rode out to Cottonwood Creek with 2 other riders to help move Elias's herd down off the high pasture ahead of an early September storm. It was on its face an ordinary neighborly courtesy, the kind ranchers extended each other all the time in that country, and Elias, wary but unwilling to refuse help he genuinely needed with a storm coming, accepted it. What happened on that drive, the official account, going around Larkspur, inside 2 days, was simple and terrible and entirely plausible. 1,100 head spooked hard on a narrow stretch of trail, above Cottonwood Gorge. Nobody could say exactly why, and Elias Vance, caught on foot trying to turn the leaders before they ran the whole herd off the rim, went down under their hooves and did not get back up. Dutch Marrow himself, ashen-faced and appropriately shaken, was the one who rode into town to fetch the sheriff and break the news to Orinda, delivering it with just enough grief in his voice that nobody in Larkspur thought to ask why a herd that had never once stampeded on that trail in 3 years happened to be riding it. Larkspur buried Elias Vance on a gray Thursday under a stand of cottonwoods on a rise above the ranch house he'd built with his own hands. Half the valley turning out for the funeral because Elias, whatever else was true of him, had been well liked. Fair and steady neighbor who'd helped raise more than one barn and never once been known to cheat a man out of a fair price. Orinda stood at that graveside in a borrowed black dress with a grief so total it felt almost physical, a weight pressing down through her chest into the ground itself, and heard over and over in the days that followed the same gentle, useless refrain from well-meaning neighbors that it was a tragedy, a terrible piece of bad luck, the kind of thing that happened on a cattle drive sooner or later, no matter how careful a man was. Nobody in Larkspur, not Sheriff Ott Gable, a decent but unambitious man who took Dutch Marrow's account at face value and closed his inquiry inside a week, and not one single neighbor who'd known Elias 9 years, thought to look twice at a stampede on a trail that had never produced one before. Because Silas Corbin's bank held paper on most of that same neighborhood, and a careful, comfortable silence had settled over Larkspur years before that, nobody quite acknowledged out loud. Corbin waited 11 days after the funeral, a decent enough interval to avoid outright scandal, before his bank sent formal notice that the note on Cottonwood Creek, the note Elias had been 3 days from paying off in full when he died, was now delinquent and due in its entirety within 30 days, the original terms. His clerk explained to Orinda with practiced regret, having lapsed automatically upon the borrower's death, per a clause she did not remember Elias ever mentioning, and could not, in the grief-fogged weeks that followed, find her own copy of the papers to check. Corbin came to Cottonwood Creek himself a week later, sat at her own kitchen table with his hat in his lap and an expression of pained, neighborly sympathy arranged carefully over his face, and offered her what he called generous terms. The bank would forgive the balance, entirely, more than fair, more than any grieving widow had a right to expect. Des, in exchange for a simple deed transfer of the ranch and its water rights, effective immediately, with a small cash sum on top to help her get settled somewhere more suited to a woman on her own. Orinda, sitting across her own table from the man whose bank had squeezed the last breathing room out of her husband's finances for 2 years running, understood with a clarity that cut straight through her grief exactly what she was being offered. Then, words considerably sharper than the ones he'd used, that she had no intention of signing anything, and would thank him to leave her land. What followed over the next 6 weeks was not violence, at least not the kind that left marks a doctor could document, but something Orinda came to understand was in some ways crueler for being so deniable. A slow, deliberate campaign to make her position in Larkspur untenable. Rumors began drifting through town that the Vance ranch had been failing for years before Elias died, that he'd taken to drink and reckless risk-taking under debts nobody had known about, that Orinda herself had been seen keeping company the previous spring in a manner no respectable widow ought to be seen keeping company with anyone. Every bit of it invented, and every bit of it calibrated precisely to make Larkspur's decent, church-going citizens feel a little less sympathetic about a widow being pressed off her land. The mercantile stopped extending her credit within a month, citing vague concerns about the estate's solvency. Neighbors who had turned out 60 strong for Elias's funeral began finding reasons not to meet her eye on the street, not from any real belief in the rumors, but from the same quiet, comfortable fear that had kept Sheriff Gable's inquiry short and the Dunmores and the Ocoas from ever getting a fair hearing either. By the time the 30 days on Corbin's ultimatum had nearly run out, Orinda Vance stood almost entirely alone in a town that had liked her husband well enough to bury him with 60 mourners and had not, in the 6 weeks since, produced a single person. Larkspur's silence was not cowardice exactly, or not only cowardice, it was the particular corrosive fear of a small town that has watched what happens to anyone who crosses the man who holds every note in the county. Refined over 6 years into a habit so ingrained that most folks in Larkspur had stopped thinking of it as fear at all and simply called it being sensible. The preacher, a gentle, weary man named Reverend Silas Corbin, who shared a first name with Corbin and had never once in 11 years enjoyed the coincidence, prayed for the widow Vance from his pulpit every Sunday. Sheriff Gable, for his part, was not a corrupt man in any way he would have recognized in himself. He simply understood, in the plain, unexamined way most men in Larkspur understood it, that a sheriff who looked too hard at Silas Corbin's business was a sheriff who would not hold his job past the next election, and had decided, years before Orinda ever needed him to decide otherwise, that keeping the job mattered more than any one widow's complaint. Almost entirely alone, but not quite, Cobb Whitfield, a leathery, soft-spoken man who had ridden for the Vance outfit since before Orinda ever stepped off that stage from Ohio, had stayed on through every one of those 6 weeks without pay, because, as he explained plainly the one time she tried to release him from any obligation, alias Vance had pulled him out of a Yellowstone flood in '76 with his own 2 hands, and Cobb did not intend to abandon what was left of that debt now. It was Cobb who tried hardest to talk her out of what she decided to do on the 29th night of the 30 Corbin had allotted her, walk into the Silver Spur Saloon herself, on a Friday when half the valley's ranchers would be in town and Corbin would be holding his usual court at the corner table, dinned front of witnesses who could not later pretend they hadn't heard it, either a fair extension or a straight answer about why a herd that had never stampeded before killed her husband the one day Dutch Marrow's crew. Cobb warned her it was a fool's errand, that Corbin owned every man in that room in one way or another, and she'd get nothing from it but humiliation. Orinda understood the risk better than Cobb did, in truth, and went anyway, because 30 days of silence and rumor had taught her that quiet dignity had gotten her exactly nowhere, and she had run out of better options and out of patience besides. There had been a stranger drinking quietly at the Silver Spur's far end of the bar for 4 evenings running by the time Orinda made her decision, a lean, dark-haired man, somewhere past 30, who spoke to almost no one beyond what buying a drink required, had stopped asking about his business in Larkspur after the second night. Nobody in town knew his name. He had arrived on the same eastbound stage as a letter Silas Corbin received the same week, a letter from a Denver fixer named Ambrose Teague, whom Corbin used sparingly and at considerable expense whenever a problem in the valley required a delicacy his own crew lacked. Doper that letter's careful instructions to assess and, if necessary, resolve a stubborn, potentially dangerous situation involving a widow refusing a generous settlement on a contested piece of ranch property. He had been told the widow was unstable, prone to wild accusations that could damage the bank's standing if left unaddressed, and he had come to Larkspur prepared to believe exactly that, because in 11 years of this work the story he was handed at the start of a job was very rarely the whole truth. And he had learned to watch quietly for the gap between what he'd been told and what he actually found before he decided how a job would end. Higgins didn't know his name. Larkspur would come before the month was out, to know it as Jubal, and to understand exactly why nobody outside 3 territories had ever managed to hire him twice. Orinda walked into the Silver Spur a little after 8 that Friday night, in her good dark dress, the one she'd been married in, chin level and hand steady, despite everything Cobb's warnings had cost her in nerve, and crossed the crowded room straight to Corbin's corner table without waiting to be acknowledged, because 6 weeks of being talked around and talked over had taught her that waiting for permission got a woman nothing in that town. She asked, in a voice pitched to carry for 30 more days on the note, and for a straight answer about the stampede that no honest rancher in the room could explain away as ordinary bad luck. The room went quiet, in the particular way a room goes quiet when everyone present understands something dangerous is happening, and nobody wants to be the one it lands on. Corbin, unhurried, produced from inside his coat a ledger page he claimed showed Elias Vance had been drinking away bank money for a year before his death, debts accumulated at that very saloon that dwarfed anything Orinda knew about, and suggested that a widow making public accusations against the man, generously trying to settle her husband's disgraceful debts, ought to consider whether she wanted the whole valley knowing the truth about the man she'd buried. It was a lie built entirely out of forged figures, and Corbin's own steady, practiced calm, and Orinda named it plainly, in front of 40 witnesses, and it was that, the public naming of the lie rather than the lie itself, that Corbin could not let stand. He nodded once to 2 of Dutch Marrow's men standing near the door, and Orinda felt hard hands close on both her arms before she'd finished her sentence, half carried and half dragged the length of the room while the crowd, uncertain and frightened, and then the saloon doors swung open onto the cold street, and she was thrown, hard off the boardwalk, into the mud, landing with enough force to split her lip, while behind her the room's tension broke into the ugly, relieved laughter. It was in the middle of that laughter, kneeling in the mud with blood on her mouth and every eye in Larkspur either laughing or looking away, that Orinda heard, faint under the noise, the sound of a glass being set down carefully at the far end of the bar and a chair scraping back, unhurried, the way a man moves when he has already decided exactly what happens next. Jubal crossed the Silver Spur's floor without hurrying and without a word, and the laughter died out ahead of him in a widening circle the way water pulls back from a dropped stone. 40 men suddenly finding their glasses and their boots considerably more interesting than the stranger walking toward the door. He didn't draw, didn't raise his voice, didn't so much as look directly at Dutch Marrow's 2 men still standing near the threshold. He simply stepped between them and the door, waited, unhurried until they backed off on their own. He offered her his hand without a word yet, helped her to her feet, and walked her the length of the block to where Cobb Whitfield sat waiting anxiously with the wagon, and turned back toward the Silver Spur. Only once she was safely up onto the seat, without any of them being able to say exactly why, that something in Larkspur had just changed. If a wronged widow finding real justice is the kind of story that keeps you watching, become a channel member and tap Join beside the channel name to help keep these stories coming. Now back to that street outside the Silver Spur, because Jubal Creed, though nobody in Larkspur would learn his full name for weeks, yet had been sent to that town to solve a problem for Silas Corbin, and what he had just watched happen to Orinda Vance had put the first real crack in 11 years of believing the men who hired him told him the truth. He found her again that same night an hour past dark, standing at the edge of Cottonwood Creek's front gate with Cobb Whitfield's shotgun laid across her knees, having refused Cobb's suggestion that she sleep at his own place until things settled, because leaving her land unguarded even one night felt to Orinda like handing Silas Corbin exactly what he wanted. Jubal came on foot, leading his horse rather than riding up on her in the dark, and stopped a respectful 30 feet short of the gate before he spoke, letting her know plainly that he meant no harm, that he'd seen enough in that saloon to want to understand the rest of it, and that he'd be obliged if she'd let him check her fence line and outbuildings for anything that looked like trouble before he rode on for the night. Orinda, who had every reason in the world to distrust a stranger who'd been sitting quietly in Silas Corbin's saloon for 4 days before tonight, kept the shotgun where he could see it, and made clear she didn't need a stranger's protection and didn't much trust strangers who showed up offering it uninvited. He didn't argue the point. He simply let her know, with a plainness she would come to recognize as entirely characteristic of him, that he'd be down by the creek line regardless whether she trusted it or not, and that she was welcome to come find him there if anything troubled her in the night. Made himself a cold camp within sight of her house, and not one step closer, and stayed there until first light without once approaching the door. Jubal spent the better part of the next 2 days doing the kind of quiet, patient asking around that had made him worth the considerable money Ambrose Teague's clients paid for his work, starting with the town doctor, a tired, careful man named Amos Talbot, who had examined Elias Vance's body. Jubal suspected correctly from the way Talbot's eyes moved when the subject came up, never been entirely satisfied with his own conclusions. Talbot, once he'd satisfied himself that Jubal wasn't asking, on Corbin's behalf, gave up what he'd kept to himself for 2 months out of a fear he was ashamed of now, that the bruising pattern on Elias Vance's body hadn't matched a man trampled while running on foot, that the injuries sat wrong for the story Dutch Marrow had given, more consistent. On Talbot's professional judgment, with a man struck and dragged than with one caught under running hooves, a discrepancy he'd noted in his private examination log and then never raised with Sheriff Gable, because Gable's inquiry had closed itself inside a week and understood exactly whose interests a longer investigation would have inconvenienced. Talbot handed Jubal his private notes, without being asked twice, and confessed quietly that he'd hoped for 2 months somebody honest would eventually come asking the right questions. From Talbot's office, Jubal went to the Land Claims Registry, where a nervous, bespectacled young clerk named Wendell Pruitt kept the county's official records of every deed transfer and note filed against property in the valley, and where Jubal, presenting himself plainly as a man looking into irregularities on behalf of a client with an interest in Cottonwood Creek, found Pruitt considerably more forthcoming than his employer would have liked. Pruitt pulled the original loan documents on the Vance ranch and laid them side by side with the ledger page Corbin had produced publicly at the Silver Spur, and the discrepancy took less than 10 minutes to find. The original note, filed and dated in Elias Vance's own hand, carried none of the accumulated drinking debts Corbin's saloon ledger claimed, and the balance due at the time of Elias's death, calculated honestly against the original terms, came to considerably less than half of what Corbin's bank had demanded from Orinda. Pruitt, sweating through the whole examination and glancing repeatedly at his office door, admitted in a low rush that he'd been quietly copying irregular filings for the better part of a year, uneasy about a pattern across 9 separate homestead transfers, but too frightened of losing his position, or worse, to raise it with anyone who might act on it. He produced, from a locked drawer, he'd clearly been waiting a long time for the right person to ask about, copies of every one of those 9 files. It was somewhere in the space of those 2 days, walking back from Pruitt's office with 9 folders of quiet, careful fraud tucked under his arm, that Jubal allowed himself to fully face what he'd been circling since he watched Orinda Vance thrown off that boardwalk into the mud, that Ambrose Teague's letter describing an unstable, dangerous widow making wild accusations had been, from the first line to the last, a story built to make Jubal comfortable, doing exactly what Silas Corbin needed done, and that he had very nearly agreed, on the strength of it, to spend however long it took making Orinda Vance's life in Larkspur unlivable enough that she'd sign whatever paper Corbin put in front of her. He had taken jobs on bad information before. Every man in his line of work eventually did, but never one built this carefully, this deliberately, around the specific character of the person he was meant to move against, and the realization sat in his chest with a weight he hadn't carried in years, not since a war that had taught him the hard way what following orders, built on someone else's convenient lies, could cost. Jubal held to a small handful of rules he had never broken in 11 years of this work. He did not ride for men who lied to him about the job, and he did not, under any circumstance. Silas Corbin, without knowing it yet, had just broken both at once. The stories that had followed Jubal across 3 territories, half legend even among men who had hired him personally, traced back to 2 hard years after a war he did not speak of easily and had not spoken of at all. In Larkspur, a Kansas Cattle Association posting him barely 23. To root out rustling operations too well connected and too well armed for any county sheriff to touch. Work that taught him, over those 2 years, exactly how often the men paying for a job lied about what the job actually required, and exactly what it cost a man's conscience to keep doing that work anyway. He had walked away from the association the year he turned 25, resolved to stop letting other men's money decide who deserved trouble and who didn't, and had spent the 8 years since taking only the jobs that let him make that decision for himself, which meant more often than the men who hired him ever expected. Quietly walking away from a contract once he understood who was really being hurt by it, and occasionally, when walking away wasn't enough, turning the job around entirely onto the man who'd hired him. He had done exactly that twice before Larkspur, once in Wyoming and once in the Dakotas, and both times the story that spread afterward had grown a little in the retelling, until men who had never met him began describing him to each other in a single hushed word rather than a name. Because nobody who had actually crossed him seemed eager to use his real one. Standing in Cottonwood Creek's kitchen with Amos Talbot's notes spread across the table, Jubal understood he was about to do exactly the same thing a 3rd time, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he minded it a good deal less than he once might have. The last piece came from an unexpected direction 2 evenings later, when a young rider named Pate Coy, barely 20, and visibly sick with something he'd been carrying for 2 months, found Jubal alone at the livery and gave up in a voice that shook the whole way through that he'd been one of the 3 riders on the drive the day Silas Vance died, and that no herd had stampeded on its own that morning. Dutch Marrow had fired 2 shots into the air behind the leaders at precisely the moment Alias was crossing the narrow stretch above the gorge, close enough and sudden enough to send 1,100 head running in exactly the direction Marrow wanted, and Pate Coy had watched it happen from 40 yards off and understood, with a sick certainty that hadn't left him since, that he just watched a man murdered and dressed up as an accident by his own boss. He had stayed silent for 2 months out of plain fear. Fear of Marrow, fear of Corbin's reach, fear of what happened to men in that valley who talked out of turn and had only found the nerve to speak now because he'd watched, standing near the back of the Silver Spur that Friday night. A stranger step between 2 of Marrow's men and a woman being thrown into the street, and understood that somebody in Larkspur had finally arrived, willing to do something about it. Jubal listened to every word of it without interrupting once, and when Pate Coy finished, asked only whether he'd be willing to repeat it in front of a federal land agent if it came to that. Pate Coy said he would. Jubal understood, walking away from the livery that night with 3 separate threads of proof now sitting in his saddlebag, that he'd reached the point where playing along with Ambrose Teague's original letter had stopped being useful and started being dangerous. But he understood, too, that Corbin still believed him a hired hand rather than a problem. And that belief was worth protecting a little longer, if it bought him time to get everything he'd gathered into hands that could actually act on it. He went to Corbin the next morning and reported carefully that the widow was proving more resistant than expected, but not unmanageable, and Corbin, satisfied enough with the account and increasingly anxious about the public scene at his own saloon 2 nights before, gave Jubal a set of instructions considerably uglier than anything the original letter had described. Burn the Vance hay barn before the week was out, quietly enough that it read as accident, and make certain the widow understood, without anyone saying so directly. Jubal agreed to it with the same flat, unbothered calm he had used on every job for 11 years, and rode back out toward Cottonwood Creek that same afternoon with no intention whatsoever of burning anything, but with a very clear understanding now that Silas Corbin's patience and Dutch Marrow's crew were not going to wait much longer for results. Jubal had no plans to deliver. The attack came 2 nights later, not the barn burning Corbin had ordered, but something Dutch Marrow had apparently decided on his own initiative was more efficient. 4 riders coming in fast and quiet after midnight to spook the Vance cattle herd off the high pasture. A piece of cruelty precise enough that Marrow clearly meant it as more than simple sabotage. Jubal had been camped within sight of the herd every night since his first conversation with Cobb Whitfield, and he met the 4 riders a quarter-mile short of the pasture, alone, standing in open ground with his hands visible and his voice pitched low and level, letting them know plainly that the herd wasn't moving that night, or any night. Without Orinda Vance's say-so, 2 of the riders, reading something in his stillness that made the whole errand feel suddenly like a poor idea, wheeled and rode off without argument. The other 2 didn't, and what followed in the dark above Cottonwood Creek was fast and entirely one-sided. 4 minutes of gunfire that left 1 man wounded and disarmed in the grass, face down and unmoving, before he'd managed to clear his own weapon twice. Jubal left both men where they lay for their friends to find, rode back down to the ranch house, and gave Orinda a plain, complete account of exactly what had happened and exactly why, the first fully honest conversation the 2 of them had shared. Word of what had happened above Cottonwood Creek reached Dutch Marrow before sunrise, carried by the 2 riders who had turned back, and it was in trying to piece together exactly who this stranger was that Marrow finally made a connection that turned his stomach, of a lean, quiet gunman who had broken up a rustling ring so thoroughly and so fast that the men behind it stopped hiring anyone at all, rather than risk crossing his path twice. A man the association's own investigators had never managed to learn a full name for, known across 3 territories only, by the single word men used when they wanted to describe exactly how much trouble somebody was in, without saying it plainly. Marrow rode to Corbin's house at first light, badly shaken, and laid out what he suspected. That the stranger Corbin had hired through Ambrose Teague to handle a widow problem, the same nameless gunslinger whose reputation had emptied out an entire outlaw operation in Wyoming without the man ever once needing to fire more than a handful of shots to do it. Corbin, hearing it, went very quiet for a long moment, running back through every instruction he had given Jubal over the past week, and understanding widows like Orinda deserve champions. So if this story moved you, tap join beside the channel name and become a channel member today. Now, back to Cottonwood Creek, because Silas Corbin had just realized exactly what kind of man he'd invited into Larkspur, and he had considerably less time left to fix it than he understood. Jubal laid it all out for her that same morning, sitting across her own kitchen table where Corbin had once sat, offering to buy her grief at a discount, who had sent him what he'd been given as the reason, and how completely that reason had fallen apart against what he'd actually found in 2 days of asking honest questions. Decent people who had been waiting a long time for someone to ask. He set Amos Talbot's private notes and Wendell Pruitt's 9 folders and the true accounting of her husband's note out on the table between them, and let her know plainly that Pate Coy had watched Dutch Marrow fire the shots that killed Elias Vance and was willing to say so. Orinda sat with all of it a long while before she spoke, working through 2 months of grief and rage and careful exhausted dignity, now finding, all at once, somewhere real to land, and when she finally looked up at him, it was not with the wariness she'd carried since the gate 3 nights before, something that understood exactly what it had cost a man in his line of work to walk away from a paying job and toward a fight that offered him nothing but trouble. "Why tell me the truth?" she asked him quietly, "when riding on would have cost you nothing at all." Jubal considered the question longer than she expected before he answered that he'd stopped, somewhere around 11 years back, being able to look away from something like what he'd watched happen to her in that saloon, and didn't much see the use in starting again now. They spent the next 4 days building methodically and carefully the case that would need to survive a courtroom rather than simply satisfy a suspicion. Orinda's own memory of every one of Corbin's offers and every strange piece of misfortune that had befallen the Dunmores and the Ocoas and 7 other families proving. Once laid alongside Wendell Pruitt's copied filings, a pattern too consistent and too well-timed to explain away as coincidence. Amos Talbot agreed after some persuading and no small amount of fear for his own position to put his private examination notes into a sworn statement. Pate Coy agreed to testify to what he'd seen on the trail above the gorge, and to name specifically which shots Dutch Marrow fired, and when. Jubal, drawing on 11 years of knowing exactly which officials in a territory could not be bought, and which absolutely could, sent word by the fastest rider he could hire toward the territorial capital. Addressed to a federal land agent named Corliss Beaumont, whose name he remembered from an earlier job as a man who had made something of a personal specialty out of prosecuting exactly this kind of bank and land fraud, requesting that Beaumont come to Larkspur himself as soon as he was able, to examine evidence of systematic fraud and at least one likely murder tied to Silas Corbin's bank. Corbin learned of Jubal's true identity and his sudden, thorough betrayal within 2 days, when Ambrose Teague's next letter arrived confirming Marrow's worst fear in writing and adding, with the particular coldness of a man protecting his own reputation, that Teague had no idea the man he'd sent was operating outside his usual arrangements and would take no responsibility for whatever happened next in Larkspur. Corbin, cornered and increasingly desperate as word reached him that a federal land agent had been sent for, made the same calculation men like him always eventually made once patience stopped working. He gathered every man on his payroll willing to carry a gun. Close to 20, counting Marrow's crew, and a handful of bank hands pressed into service for the occasion, and gave the order that Cottonwood Creek and everyone on it needed to be dealt with, permanently and completely. Because a dead widow and a missing stranger left considerably less for a federal agent to build a case out of than a living one telling her story in a courtroom. The warning reached Cottonwood Creek the night before, carried at a hard gallop by Pate Coy, who had overheard enough of Corbin's planning at the bank to understand exactly what was coming at first light and had made, in that moment, the same choice he'd made at the livery days before, that whatever it cost him with Dutch Marrow's crew. He was done being the kind of man who watched and said nothing. Jubal spent the last hours of darkness positioning what defense the ranch could manage. Cobb Whitfield dug in at the barn's corner with a rifle he'd carried since the war. Pate Coy, shaking but resolved, covering the approach from the north fence line. The ground he knew Corbin's riders would have to cross to reach either the barn or the house. Orinda refused, flatly, and for the last time that night Jubal's suggestion that she take shelter in town until it was over made clear she had buried one husband on this ground already and did not intend to be somewhere else while the rest of it was decided, and took up Elias's old rifle instead. Positioned at the house's front window with a clear line down the whole approach. Dawn came thin and gray over Cottonwood Creek, the cottonwoods along the water gone still and silver with early frost, and Corbin's riders came up the valley road in a loose, confident column a little after first light, close to 20 strong. Silas Corbin himself, riding near the back, in a heavy coat that marked him out, even at distance, as a man unused to riding toward danger, rather than simply ordering others into it. Jubal let them come to within 150 yards before he stepped out from the creek, crossing into plain sight, rifle held loose but ready, and called out across the frosted ground in a voice that carried the particular flat authority of a man who had done this exact kind of mourning. He named Corbin directly, let him know that a federal land agent already had sworn statements covering 9 fraudulent land transfers and 1 murder. That riding on Cottonwood Creek now would only add a mass killing to whatever charges already waited for him in the territorial capital, and gave him one chance to turn his men around before the morning went somewhere. Neither of them could take back. Corbin, his voice thin with fear and fury both, shouted back that Jubal was 1 man bluffing against 20 and gave Marrow's crew the order to advance. What followed was fast, ugly, and over inside a handful of minutes, the compressed violence of men who had ridden up that valley believing the fight would cost them nothing, discovering, in the worst possible way, Jubal's first shot took the rider nearest Corbin clean out of the saddle before the man cleared his own weapon, and the column that had come up the road so confident scattered wide under sudden real return fire from 3 well-placed positions instead of the single easy target they'd expected. More than half of them finding an urgent unwillingness to die for Silas Corbin's wages, the moment those wages started costing something real. Cobb Whitfield's rifle dropped 2 horses and put 3 more riders to flight without a second shot needed. Orinda, steady at the window with Elias's old rifle, put a round through the shoulder of a man closing on the barn and did not flinch doing it. And Jubal, moving forward through smoke and scattering horses with the flat, unhurried purpose of a man who had done this kind of mourning before and remembered every hard lesson of it, worked his way toward Dutch Marrow, directly until it was the 2 of them alone in the frosted grass, and 2 months of murder and lies sitting between them in the cold morning air. Jubal did not kill him. He put him on the ground at gunpoint instead, bound and disarmed, worth considerably more standing in front of a federal agent telling the truth about Corbin's orders than dead in the grass. That a second column of riders came up the valley road an hour later. Not Corbin's men this time, but a territorial marshal's posse riding alongside a lean, sharp-eyed federal land agent who had ridden through the last of the night rather than wait for full daylight once he'd read what Jubal's rider had carried to him. Corliss Beaumont took one look at the scene in front of him, a bank foreman kneeling bound in the frost, Silas Corbin frozen and pale on his horse, a saddlebag of sworn statements and copied ledgers waiting to be handed over, and understood immediately he had arrived at the end of something considerably larger than a single ranch dispute. Corbin tried every argument a cornered man tries, that Jubal was an unlicensed vigilante who had attacked lawful men without authority, that the ledgers were forgeries planted to discredit an honest bank. But Dutch Marrow, kneeling in the frost with his own life very obviously depending on how cooperative he chose to be in the next several minutes. made the calculation frightened men in his position usually make, and began talking, plainly and at length, about 2 years of instructions received directly from Silas Corbin, regarding 9 separate land claims, the Dunmore's barn, Old Man Ochoa's poisoned well, and finally, in careful damning detail, the 2 shots he had fired above Cottonwood Gorge on Corbin's standing instruction to remove any rancher who refused a settlement outright. Corbin was placed under federal arrest before the morning was finished, and word of the arrest, and of exactly why it had happened, reached the Silver Spur Saloon by that same evening, carried into the same room. Orinda walked back into the Silver Spur 11 days later, at Sheriff Gable's own request, to give her formal statement for the territorial record, in front of the same bar, the same corner table, and more than a few of the same faces who had watched her thrown out onto the boardwalk without a single one of them stepping forward to stop it. Nobody in that room laughed this time. She stood where she had knelt in the mud 2 weeks before, Jubal a quiet, steady presence a few feet behind her rather than at the far end of the bar this time, and gave the room a plain, unhurried account in the same voice she had used the night Corbin tried to shame her into silence, of exactly what had happened to her husband, and exactly who had ordered it done. And this time, when she finished, Higgins, the bartender, was the first man in the room to say without hesitation, "The federal case against Silas Corbin, once Beaumont's office had time to work through the full extent of it, turned up enough additional fraud across 9 claims to force his bank into a formal restitution settlement that returned deeded land or fair compensation to every family he had pushed off water rights over 6 years. The Dunmores got their claim back outright. Old Man Ochoa received compensation that let his children finally return west from Cheyenne, and Orinda Vance's note on Cottonwood Creek was voided entirely. The ranch and its water rights restored to her name, free and clear, with Corbin himself sentenced to a long stretch in the territorial prison at Deer Lodge and Dutch Marrow, whose cooperation bought him a lighter sentence than his crimes otherwise deserved. Larkspur, chastened by its own 6 weeks of comfortable silence, turned out with genuine force once the danger had passed, and the guilt had time to work on people's consciences. Neighbors who had crossed the street to avoid her showing up that spring with lumber and labor to rebuild the hay barn. Reverend Croom, in the first sermon he preached after the trial, said Corbin's name aloud from the pulpit for the first time in 11 years, and told his congregation plainly that silence dressed up as prudence was still just silence. Jubal stayed on through that whole rebuilding, telling himself at first it was only sensible to see the work through, and then, as the weeks became a season and the season became most of a year, admitting to Orinda and to himself both that he had found reason to stop riding for other men's money and stay in one place that finally felt like it wanted him there. He never did take up the Vance name, and Larkspur in time stopped needing him to. The whole valley came instead to know him simply as the man who had stood between Orinda Vance and everyone who ever tried to take Cottonwood Creek from her again, and found, in the end, that no name they could have given him would have suited him half as well as the one he already had. Cobb Whitfield stayed on as foreman, proud and unbothered by the arrangement, and Pate Coy, cleared of any real wrongdoing once his testimony helped seal Corbin's conviction, took work on the Vance spread that spring and stayed there for years, the guilt he had carried since the morning above the gorge, slowly making room, over time, for something closer to peace. Orinda rebuilt the hay barn on the same ground it had always stood on, but raised, at Cobb's quiet suggestion, on a stone foundation this time, sturdier than the one before it, the kind of thing built by people who intend to still be standing on that ground a long time from now. If you made it this far with Orinda and Jubal tonight, you already know why stories like this one keep pulling people back to the fire. A woman who refused to be shamed off her own ground, and a stranger who decided, somewhere in the middle of a job built on lies, that some things were worth more than the money he was being paid to ignore them. If this is the kind of frontier story you want more of, hit subscribe before you go, and I'll see you at the next fire. Until then, take care of yourselves out there, and I'll meet you back here soon.